On the morning of July 29th, 2025, 50 Burkinabe soldiers lay lifeless in the dust. No alarms, no return fire, just silence, then flame. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than a military loss. It was a line crossed, because this wasn't just war, it was warning. Too perfect, too precise, too political. And at the center of this wound stands one man. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, steeled, and utterly unmoved by intimidation. While others saw bodies, he saw battle lines drawn not just in sand, but in sovereignty. What if this wasn't just an attack? What if it was a message? And what happens when a nation refuses to kneel, even in mourning? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that no longer bows its head. From pain to resistance, they called it a military loss. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, no one spoke of war. They spoke of betrayal. Within hours of the July 29th attack, flags hung half-mast. Schools shut their doors. Markets paused their music. Radio stations replaced their jingles with scripture. For the first time in decades, silence became Burkina Faso's loudest language. The state funeral arrived swiftly, not with grandeur but with gravity. 50 caskets draped in red, green, and gold. Mothers held scarves to their mouths. Widows stood rigid. Children blinked without understanding. But it was not the president's voice that filled the capital. It was his presence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked alone between the rows. No umbrella, no bodyguards, just his fatigues, his clenched jaw, and eyes that held both fury and fire. He didn't speak into microphones. He stood beside a weeping mother, knelt by a fallen soldier's brother, bowed before every casket. And that's when something changed. The grief began to shift into something sharper. Men stood straighter. Women held each other tighter. Students returned to campuses wearing black armbands. Taxi drivers flew flags from their mirrors. In every corner of the country, the pain turned personal. By sundown, the whispers had become a roar. This was no accident. This was no jihadist ambush. This was a message. Military analysts tried to label the attack as a terrorist incident. But too many things didn't add up. Surveillance drones disabled. Communications jammed. Reinforcements never received the call. The strike was surgical, not spontaneous. In the mosques, sermons shifted. In churches, candles burned longer. On social media, images of the fallen began circulating, with captions that read, "Not gone too soon, but taken too deliberately." And above them all, one name kept rising: Traoré, because he didn't retreat to a secure room. He didn't ask for help. He didn't condemn with press releases. Instead, he stepped forward into the grief, into the danger, into the storm. He stood before a gathering of youth the day after the funeral and said only this: "Let no one tell you to lower your head. If they can kill 50 of us and still expect silence, they do not know the Burkinabe soul." Those words ignited something far greater than outrage. It ignited a vow. From Kaya to Koudougou, young men lined up outside recruitment offices, not just for revenge, but for readiness. Women brought meals to soldiers on guard. Teachers rewrote lesson plans to include the names of the 50 fallen. And in the dusty village of Diapaga, where 7 of the victims were born, their neighbors gathered around a mural in progress, each brushstroke a promise that memory would never fade. Across the Atlantic, the story began surfacing in diaspora circles. Black churches in Atlanta held vigils. African-American veterans in Chicago posted video tributes. And on YouTube, voices began saying aloud what many feared. Some deaths are meant to frighten, others to provoke surrender. But Burkina Faso didn't bow. Instead, it prepared. Captain Ibrahim's latest news wasn't a retreat, it was a recalibration. For Traoré, mourning wasn't weakness. It was the soil from which resistance would rise. And resistance, this time, would come not in borrowed uniforms or second-hand weapons, but in something Africa had long been denied: self-made power, rebuilt from the ashes. In the heart of Ouagadougou, hidden behind rusting gates and cracked concrete, stood a forgotten repair facility once used to service government trucks. For years, it lay silent, just another relic of underfunded ambition. But after July 29th, that silence ended. The machines came first, then the engineers, then the secrecy. President Traoré gave no televised announcement, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a simple order delivered quietly to a trusted circle. build something that flies, and let it answer to no one but us. Thus began Project Never Again. What had once been a warehouse for broken axles and stripped engines became the birthplace of a revolution. Young technicians, some just weeks out of university, joined ranks with battle-worn mechanics and retired Air Force personnel. Together, they worked under oil-stained lights and improvised benches, soldering dreams into steel. Their mission: build drones, not replicas, not imported kits, but Burkinabe machines designed, tested, and produced on native soil. The phrase painted above the entrance said it all. Never again will Burkina Faso be caught off guard. Security was impenetrable. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Entry required biometric scans. Even delivery trucks were inspected twice. Inside, the mood was electric-focused, feverish, and fiercely proud. One engineer, speaking under anonymity, described it simply: "We are not just building drones, we are building sovereignty." Early prototypes struggled. Some engines overheated in the Sahel heat. Others lost signal beyond 30 kilometers. But each failure was met not with frustration, but with fire. Adjust, rewire, test again. It was the kind of persistence that no foreign consultant could teach, only a wounded nation could summon. Captain Ibrahim Traoré visited the facility one night, just after midnight. No cameras, no entourage, just him and the machines. He watched a test unit take flight, its wings humming against the desert wind. He didn't smile. He nodded and said, 50 of our sons died because we waited for others to protect us. That ends here. The drone program, codenamed Kudugu Falcon, expanded rapidly. 2 aerial models entered final testing stages by late August. One was designed for surveillance, with a 1,000 km range. The other, a short-range strike drone, capable of precision targeting within a 500 m radius. Each component, from rotors to wiring, was either manufactured in-country or sourced from within the African continent. There were no foreign advisors, no contracts signed in European boardrooms, no loans from development banks with small print traps. This was power unfiltered, unbought, unapologetic. For followers of Africa News, the implications were seismic. A country once considered among the least industrialized in West Africa was now building weapon systems that rivaled imported models at a fraction of the cost and with full control over usage. The project wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. Mothers whose sons had died on July 29th began volunteering at the facility, preparing meals, writing messages of encouragement, even stitching red cloth into pilot uniforms. Students from engineering academies submitted blueprints unsolicited. A young woman from Bobo Dioulasso sent a design for a solar-powered charging station that could keep drones flying without a fuel line. They called them Freedom Wings. The world watched quietly, too quietly. Western analysts described it as unsustainable. Defense journals dismissed the program as symbolic, but they underestimated something crucial. This wasn't just about drones. It was about dignity. It was about declaring that Captain Ibrahim's latest news no longer meant waiting for foreign aid. It meant building the future bolt by bolt, blade by blade. African counteroffensive doctrine. 48 hours after the funeral, smoke had faded. A quiet but unmistakable tremor shook the tarmac at Ouagadougou International Air Base. A Russian Ilyushin military transport plane landed under the cover of night. No flags, no handshakes, no headlines. But inside the aircraft were 200 Russian Special Forces operatives, fully armed, highly trained, and carrying equipment that Burkina Faso had never seen. This wasn't a military occupation. It wasn't foreign troops taking charge. It was instruction, by invitation, on Burkinabe terms. The message was clear. Traoré did not beg for help. He curated it. These Russian advisors brought with them advanced drone jamming systems, encrypted field radios, and knowledge honed in the frost of Eastern Europe and the deserts of the Middle East. Their task wasn't to lead, it was to teach. Within days, joint exercises began in the northern outskirts of Kaya. Over 800 Burkinabe soldiers trained alongside the Russian contingent, learning not just how to use new tools, but how to adapt ancient Sahelian tactics to modern warfare. By the end of the first week, observers from Mali and Niger arrived, not with diplomatic suits, but in uniform. Boots dusty, notebooks ready, because something bigger was forming. And in mid-August, it became official. From Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, a historic joint broadcast was made. The Sahel Security and Sovereignty Pact, This was no vague declaration of cooperation. It was a contract written in urgency, bound by shared blood, and enforced by strategy. 3 nations, 85 million people, one vision, African defense by Africans. The pact outlined 5 joint drone bases across the Sahel, one 500-strong rapid response force, deployable within 24 hours, shared intelligence networks and real-time surveillance grids, coordinated border patrols across more than 3,000 kilometers of terrain. But perhaps its most powerful feature wasn't military, it was philosophical. Under the guidance of Russian doctrine experts and African historians, a new strategic framework was born. The African doctrine of retaliation. Its pillars were unlike anything in existing NATO or AU doctrines. No foreign bases on African soil, self-reliant defense production, civilian defense mobilization, cultural integration of resistance, economic countermeasures against exploitative actors. This was a doctrine that made war not just a military duty, but a social contract. Everyone, from farmer to professor, had a role. Every city, every village, a node in a continent-wide defense grid, and it was working. By late August, 2 full drone squadrons, each with 12 unmanned vehicles, were operational. One patrolled the eastern border, the other circled the north. Their flight data streamed in real time to command centers staffed by young Burkinabe officers trained in the new doctrine. The global reaction was swift and split. China praised the regional innovation. Russia called it proof that sovereignty breeds strength. But in Paris and Washington, panic surfaced behind diplomatic language. Think tanks issued warnings about geopolitical realignment. NATO cables noted a 40% increase in drone activity along the Sahel corridor. Western media, once silent on Traoré, now labeled him defiant and unpredictable. But in the eyes of Burkina Faso's people and those watching from Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, and beyond, he was becoming something else entirely. A mirror of what could have been, of what still could be. Because this doctrine, this pact, this unified stand, it wasn't about isolation. It was about reclamation. And if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. And when the people take the front line, in the weeks that followed the attack, something stirred beneath the surface of Burkina Faso, not in government halls or military bases, but in the marketplaces, the classrooms, the farms, and the churches. It began with a grandmother in Tenkodogo who showed up to a local recruitment office not to enlist, but to deliver hand-sewn armbands for new soldiers. Then came a group of blacksmiths from Dori who began forging ceremonial blades not for war, but for vigil. Across the country, people weren't waiting for orders. They were writing their own. President Traoré didn't ask civilians to take up arms. They offered. The morning of July 29th had sparked not just grief, but a movement, a national mobilization unlike anything Burkina Faso had seen since its independence. This was not forced conscription. This was voluntary defiance. In Ouagadougou's Central Plaza, women gathered every morning before sunrise, cooking massive pots of millet and dried meat delivered directly to training camps. In Gawa, musicians composed a powerful anthem, "We Will Not Kneel," featuring real recordings from the widows of fallen soldiers. The song spread across the nation like wildfire. By its 3rd day, it was playing from phones, radios, and loudspeakers in over 200 villages. In the northern province of Oudalan, a convoy of young men walked for 3 days straight to reach the nearest enlistment station. Some were barefoot, all were determined. But it wasn't only the young or the fit. Teachers across 100 schools revised their curriculums to include the names, photos, and life stories of the 50 fallen soldiers. Each story became a lesson, not just in history, but in identity. On the first Friday of September, something beautiful happened. In every province, students planted trees, 50 in each schoolyard, one for every soldier lost. The initiative, called Freedom Roots, was designed to grow alongside the nation. These trees, one teacher explained, will carry their names in their rings. They will rise when we do, and rise they did. In the arid fields of Fada and Gourma, hunters offered their age-old knowledge of terrain, scent tracking, and silent signaling to new local defense units. Their techniques, once used for lion and antelope, were now taught to border patrols. In the Sahel's southern hills, elders gathered youth to tell stories of revolutions past. of betrayal resisted, of how dignity once had to be fought for, with nothing but voice and spirit. And in those circles, a new fire was lit. Even children contributed. In Bobo Dioulasso, a group of teenagers began crafting cardboard models of drones, learning the mechanics, sketching upgrades, dreaming of becoming engineers. Their teacher sent photos to the Ministry of Defense. Days later, a delegation arrived not to discourage them, but to deliver real parts. Every act mattered, because this war was not being fought only with bullets and UAVs. It was being fought with bread, with brushes, with prayer. In the city of Kaya, 15 artists worked for 10 days without pause to paint a 30-meter mural of the fallen 50. Each face, hand-drawn, eyes open, flanked by the national flag. One artist said, "This wall is not just for remembrance. It's for protection. They watch over us now." At the center of all this stood Captain Traoré, not in speeches, but in symbols, not commanding, but participating. When images surfaced of him helping unload bags of donated rice at a defense center, it wasn't for publicity. It was a reflection of how far the movement had gone. Because this was no longer a military mobilization. This was cultural defense, spiritual resistance, the assertion of a people who refused to let others define their destiny. They did not need permission to fight for their soil. They needed only the memory of those who bled on it. When the whole world has to look back, while Burkina Faso was busy planting trees and building drones, the rest of the world was watching, and not in silence. In Washington, the ambush of July 29th triggered emergency meetings behind closed doors. 3 think tanks released white papers within 72 hours, calling the Sahel the new epicenter of global instability. The language was cold, technical, but the concern was real, because something was happening in West Africa that the West could not control. In earlier months, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had been described by foreign media as young, charismatic, even energetic. Now, the words had changed. Defiant, unpredictable, radical? In Brussels, an internal European Union report warned that Traoré's model of localized strength, regional alliance, and cultural pride could spread to at least 7 African nations within 5 years. Paris responded with venom. 15 investigative reports hit the French airwaves in 2 weeks, accusing Traoré of authoritarian tendencies, economic mismanagement, and even stirring anti-Western sentiment. No evidence, just headlines. But while the West wrung its hands, Africa was rising. In Accra, Ghana, a 12-meter mural of Traoré was unveiled, fist raised, surrounded by the words, "We are done asking. We are declaring." In Lagos, Nigeria, a student-led rally drew over 8,000 people. The chant that echoed through the streets was not in French or English, but in Hausa, Wolof, and Yoruba. The message was clear. Africa understood Traoré in its own tongue. The most powerful endorsement, however, came not from protesters or presidents, but from the people who once looked to the sky for help and now looked inward for strength. Inside Burkina Faso, national service enrollment surged to 180% of pre-attack levels. In rural provinces, trained civilian volunteers rose by 40%. Across the Sahel, the pact grew. Teeth drone patrols, joint air bases, rapid response drills. No one in Washington, Paris, or even Moscow had anticipated this. A security architecture that was not Western, not Eastern, but entirely African. This was the twist. Russia provided training, but didn't dictate doctrine. China showed interest, but offered no ultimatums. Only Western diplomats grew visibly uncomfortable because they weren't being asked for permission. They were being bypassed. And at the heart of it all was one man, not in a throne room, not surrounded by luxury, but in a factory, in a funeral, on a parade ground, among his people. Captain Ibrahim latest news no longer meant speculation. It meant action. It meant alignment. It meant Africa first without apology. A confidential NATO cable summarized it best. This is no longer just a Burkinabe movement. This is a model. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came not from a military analyst, but from a vendor in a Ouagadougou market. They used to say we were too poor to defend ourselves. Now they say we're too powerful to ignore. And that's the fear, isn't it? Not that Africa is failing, but that Africa is succeeding, and doing so on its own terms. The death of 50 Burkinabe soldiers could have broken the spine of a fragile nation. Instead, it awakened a sleeping giant. From the dusty lanes of Kaya to the bustling markets of Ouagadougou, a new rhythm took hold, not of mourning, but of marching, not of silence, but of singing, not of surrender, but of standing. Traoré did not just respond to an attack. He redefined what it meant to be African in the 21st century. He showed the world that Africa is not a waiting room for foreign aid. It is a workshop of self-made power. He showed us that dignity is not granted, it's defended. That sovereignty is not a flag, it's a decision. And that when one part of Africa bleeds, the whole continent hears the cry. This isn't the story of Burkina Faso alone. It's the story of every land that was once colonized, once robbed, once silenced. And it's the story of what happens when memory becomes mission. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said, "We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it." If you believe that, say it out loud. Say it with your head high. Say it so the world hears you. Africa knew? If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.